They concoct a plan where the Israelis attack, and then the British and the French will go and intervene, but we'll have to stay here to protect it. And if you don't, then you're going to end our land lease agreement with you, and that's going to hurt your economy. So basically, Eisenhower went to the defense of an Arab dictator over its allies, the French and the British. What I would want, what's the common denominator with all of them, is not for the state to collapse. It's one thing for the regime to collapse, it's another thing for the state to collapse. The state to collapse, we want to avoid at all costs, for all parties concerned.
Simon, welcome to the World XP podcast. How you doing today?
I'm really good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you want to do a quick intro for the people, who you are and what you do? And I want to jump right into it because there's lots that I want to ask you about. And I'm sure this might be one of the, I don't know, I'm very excited about it. So anyways, the floor is yours.
Okay, my name is Simon Waldman. I'm a lecturer and a tutor at the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. I did my master's at King's College London. I did my PhD in King's College London. And so some colleagues say that I'm institutionalized. And I guess that's kind of true. I am, even though after I did my PhD, I became a lecturer at King's. And there was a period of about maybe 3 years where I decided, you know what? I want to go into the think tank world, make a difference. And I absolutely hated it. I did some think tank work in Istanbul, very nice people. I did it in London too, very nice people. I missed the teaching, so I kind of went back to King's College London in a different department this time. Before I was at Middle Eastern Studies, now I'm in Defense Studies, and I'm having a great time. It's like being a lecturer is like being a millionaire just without the money.
That's fair enough. The question from the last guest is, what was the last epic fail you experienced and how did you recover?
Oh, an epic fail. I don't think I have big epic fails, but I have lots of small failures all the time, all the time. So I had a project for a book that I was going to do. I got really excited for it. I thought it was going to be fantastic, and it just didn't work. Sometimes you do this as a historian, you go down to the archives and you just don't have something. It's not there. You've got the funding for it, right? And sometimes getting the funding is really difficult. Went down to the archives and the material is not available. It's not what I thought it was. And I start to realize that I don't have anything here. This is not going to work. And what you do is you just say, okay, there's a period where you're going to get a bit upset. You know, that's going to happen. And then you think, okay, but what can I do? What did I find in there that was interesting? Is there anything that I can take with this? What can I learn from this? And then you just move on. And that's kind of like how you deal with professional failures. When it's a personal matter, it's a lot different. When it's things about people that you care about, relationships, love, it's a different approach. But when it comes to things in your profession, you have to just say, okay, that's what being an academic is about. That's what being an entrepreneur is about. It's about failing, learning, moving on, and not dwelling on it. And yeah, that's how you do it.
Yeah, 100%. I know we were talking beforehand about early 20th century, but since maybe people will still be listening at this point, I do want to real quickly touch base on where in the world that we are with the Iran and US situation. And I'm going to caveat this by saying we're recording on June 12th. And so tomorrow something could have changed drastically. However, this is where we are. From me as I would say, fairly tuned in observer, I have no idea what's going on. And I say that because Trump seems to be contradicting himself every day. There's a deal, there's not a deal. It's about the nukes, it's not about the nukes. The nuclear program's destroyed. Now it's about regime change, but we also are negotiating with the same people that are in charge. And then also it's about whatever now it's about the Strait of Hormuz, but we're going to blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, but we don't need the oil, but we need it open, and we don't need the oil. And it's like, I think a lot of that, like, two things can be true at once, of course, but like, I don't understand, like, in my head, as an American, we just need to leave and take the L, and Trump will call it a win, and we leave and we go home. And because it's like, I don't get it. So like, where are we?
So that's the problem. The fact that you are confused, someone who's informed about international affairs, informed about US politics, and you're confused about the war aims of the president in a very costly war against Iran, and you don't know. I don't know either. No one really knows because the goalpost keeps changing, and that's the problem. And one of the biggest failures of the Trump administration in this is not defining the aims of the war right from the beginning in clear and no uncertain terms. That is the big issue. And I do the way I've seen this is the big tragedy has been for the Iranian people. When the Iranian people came out into the streets in the beginning of this year, and they heard Trump say on several occasions, I counted 7, it could have been more. Don't worry, hang in there. Help is on the way.
Yep.
And one, help was not on the way immediately. He made it seem as if it was. I don't think it was possible for help to be on the way. But he said it on several occasions. And it seems as if he used the mobilization of the people on the streets in order to negotiate a better nuclear deal. And that is incredibly cynical. It also hasn't worked. And I think that's one of the problems here. I think what's going to happen, if there's some kind of agreement that happens tomorrow or is protracted, happens in a few days later, it's going to be the terms for negotiating as opposed to the final deal. So it will be the outline will be discussed, some kind of limits to Iran's nuclear program, mixed with the unfreezing of assets, but the details will be pushed off to discuss for the next 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it is. So it won't actually be the done and dusted deal. And what that means is that, there'll be not an end to the blockade per se, but there would be the movement of different goods and services through the Strait of Hormuz. But there would still need to be the mobilization of US assets abroad. They'll still be on high alert, all while some kind of agreement will be reached and the pressure will be on for Trump to get something better than what was present under the Obama administration, which Trump was a major, major critic of.
Yeah. The other thing that throws a wrench into this all the time is every time he says that there's a ceasefire, then Israel goes to war in Lebanon again.
Yeah.
And that part, I also don't, and this is the part that really confuses me, which is in what I don't understand in what world he thought he being Trump slash the US administration thought that any of this was going to work. Like it seemed very silly from the beginning. Granted, I'm not a lecturer at the Defense College in London, or I'm not at the Naval College in the US or anything like that. But just like logistically speaking, and like it just seemed like a stupid idea from the beginning. And so now we're caught in this, and the Israel piece, I really don't understand. Like, let me, well, okay. Anyways, go ahead.
So what is kind of going on there's I wouldn't call it a discussion, but there's let's just say serious wranglings over who gets to negotiate on behalf of Lebanon. And from the perspective of the Israelis, Iran doesn't get to say, doesn't get to discuss the terms of what happens in Lebanon. Iran has no business involving itself in Lebanese politics and sponsoring Hezbollah. And if a treaty between or some kind of agreement between Iran and the US also speaks on behalf of the Israelis, that is an infringement on Israeli sovereignty. That is also an infringement of Lebanese sovereignty. You speak to each other, and Israel and Lebanon will work something out with the auspices of the United States, and that's how it can come to fruition. So the Israelis are really saying, no, you don't get to speak on behalf of Hezbollah. You don't get to speak on behalf of Lebanon. That's something that we want to do, and we ought to do, and we should do. So that's what the Israelis are saying there. And that's why it gets complicated, of course. And it goes back to that issue of Iran and its regional proxies. That's why some of the critics of the JCPOA, that's the nuclear agreement that was signed during the Obama administration, were so livid with it. He said, this is nothing about regional proxies. not just in Lebanon, but also in Iraq and other places as well. And Iran seems to think that it can have a negotiation with the United States and other international partners, and also interfere into the internal affairs of other Middle East states.
Yeah.
That's problematic, and I think that's why it becomes difficult.
Yeah. And I get the sentiment of like you don't get to talk for them. However, they are also acting as if they're doing that. So then Israel went and attacked southern Lebanon again, and then Iran shot some missiles at Israel. So it's like, yeah, you can have the opinion that they shouldn't get to talk for them, but I think in effect they are. And so
In effect,
like,
they do. Yeah, that's
but
true.
they're not acting like that. So it's like they're picking and choosing when it's like, okay, you don't get to talk for them, so we're still gonna do it, but also like it's like, okay, yeah, me and you can have the opinion that somebody shouldn't get to do something, but they are doing it, and that's how it's going.
In
And so like then from the US perspective, it like you can be like, hey, Israel, that's great that you think that, but it's we need that to stop happening if we're gonna make a deal here. So like that's the part to me, like where somebody's got to go to the table and be like, what is going on, and what do you want, and what do you want, and what do you want?
Interestingly,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, interestingly, I think if you're looking to praise Trump on this, what President Trump has been able to do is exert more influence over Israel than previous presidents. So ultimately, when it comes to that agreement that will be made with Iran, it would also include Israel not firing on Hezbollah. The extent to which that holds would then be, part of the deal. But for most issues, Netanyahu will be compliant towards Trump.
Mm,
And it's interesting. I think the strategy, and not that President Trump necessarily thought that this was his strategy. I don't think he's a strategic thinker on international affairs. He shoots from the hip. But I think his position was what some have advocated, which is the bear hug. And that's the idea of if you have a partner like Israel, where it has significant security issues, what you do is you kind of like the big bear. You just smother it with everything it needs. You need these arms, fine, you get them. You want to do this, you want to go after Iranian targets, fine, we'll support you. Hey, we'll join in, like was the case this time last year. But then by doing that, you've got this kind of vice-like bear hug over it. So when it's time to move that ally to your position, you do it. And
mm,
I think that's what's happening right now. So imagine like Trump, if you want to have the picture in your mind, imagine Trump with this kind of vice-like hug over Netanyahu. And he says, it's in your interests to move here. And I think that's what he's trying to do. And ultimately, if that agreement is reached, Israel would abide to it, certainly through Iran and also to a certain extent to Hezbollah, unless Hezbollah breaks the ceasefire itself.
I hope that's the case, and I don't mean for us to go down the Israel rabbit hole, but I don't it doesn't at least appear that way to me that Trump is exerting more influence over Israel than previous administrations. Specifically, if you talk about even getting into the war, there's stories about Netanyahu or Israeli officials trying to get the U.S. to attack Iran all the way back to Clinton and Bush and throughout. And from my from my perspective sitting here, it's like, okay, so Iraq was a complete disaster. We wasted how much money and the the lives that went into that, both from our side and the Iraqi side, and then the soldiers that come home or
Mhm.
the warfighters that come home and then have family problems, commit suicide. Like
Sure,
the
sure, sure.
costs are still ongoing from that. And from my perspective, it's like why do we need to do that again? For what? Like I don't understand the strategic aim from an American perspective specifically in there, other than the fact that the US has a relationship with Israel. But to me, if I've got the bear hug on Netanyahu, I'm like, no, stop doing that. We're not helping you this time. We just wasted X
So
number.
here's
We're
the
40 trillion in debt. Like we can't afford it.
yes. But I don't think I don't think it was really Israel who wanted necessarily to get the United States involved in this latest round of the conflict. I don't even think in the last one as well. I mean, Israel saw it in its strategic interest to bomb Iran, and the United States under Trump had either two real options: can either give the bunker buster bombs to Israel to do it themselves, or the US could get involved. And I
Hmm.
think Trump saw the potential glory in doing that. Wow, I could be the president who is known as the president who ended the Iranian nuclear program with bombs, joining in the glory, and that's what he did. This time around, it seems to be a different issue. I mean, from the perspective of the US, it is not in US interests for Iran to become a nuclear threshold state.
Sure.
It has nothing really to do with Israel. It's not just Israel, it's also the other Gulf allies as well who feel the same way. It's actually a confluence of multiple interests of US assets in the regions. So this latest round, I mean, it's going to take historians in about 30 or 40 years' time to look back and see whether this was the case or not. But it seems that Witkoff and Kushner, when they were negotiating with their Iranian counterparts, said something along the lines of, we've enriched to 60%. We have enough for 11 nuclear bombs if we wanted it. And then Kushner and Witkoff looked at each other and they said, what did they just say?
Mm.
What did they just imply? Are our nightmares going to come true if we don't take action? And that's what pushed Trump into action. If those reports are credible, Israel has really little to do with it in that respect.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
So
But I do have to add in though that when Tulsi Gabbard testified before Congress, she said that Iran, I think the statement was, Iran has not made the political decision to start working towards a nuclear weapon. So you've got that piece also. And then, so again, neither you or I are sitting in the Pentagon somewhere with the classified briefings. We don't
yeah,
know.
yeah,
So we can only go off like what's been said in the news and in the media. Um, but the other problem with that is like the payload problem. It's like, so
yeah,
yeah,
sure.
maybe, so like, can they get one to us? It doesn't seem like that's the case. I think they launched a couple empty missiles at Diego Garcia with like no payload on them at all. And what was the other thing that happened was, yeah, so then the other piece is last summer in the 12-day war, if Trump says the nuclear program's obliterated, well, then either he lied then or it was, and then what's the case now? So again, we're both like in the air reading
Yeah,
the
sure.
tea leaves.
We don't know. We don't
Hmm.
know. But the point was never that it's going to be a nuclear weapon state. It's a
Yeah.
nuclear threshold state. And do you gamble with such a regime when the jump from 60% enrichment to 90% weapons grade enrichment is so close?
Hmm.
One of the other things which happened as well, and again, I'd love to be, sifting through archives in 30 years if they're declassified on this, is the Israeli Mossad raid in Iran in 2018, which found that Iran had ceased its program to get a nuclear warhead, but didn't declare it.
Yeah.
It remained undeclared, and for it to be undeclared still during the time of the JCPOA was problematic. It's also problematic towards a non-proliferation
Yep.
treaty as well. You should declare such things, but they remained undeclared. Instead, they were put in a secret warehouse, and that erodes trust as well. So if that's the case, that they're not going to declare the progress that they've made towards weaponizing nuclear weapons, and they've reached 60% enrichment, and there's no civilian purpose for 60% enrichment. That you're either racing for a bomb for military grade, or you're not when you get to 60%. So then what do? Well, you either go and continue to negotiate, or you think that if you engage in some kind of military action, you're in a better negotiating position. And that's why I said before, that's what I think, that when the protests were happening in Iran, that's why, the Trump administration thought, wow, we're in an even better negotiating position now.
Yeah.
So
It still
yeah,
feels
that
silly to me that he backed out of the original JCPOA in the beginning, right? It's like you keep that one going. I know there were sunset provisions in it, but you keep that one
yeah.
going, and then you let the protests do what the protests do. You don't like tip your finger on the scale a little
It
bit
was the
because,
opposite. It was the
yeah.
opposite. The JCPOA, even before there were any sanctions relief, it already had kind of boosted the regime because within Iran, there was an increase of kind of of confidence, consumer confidence. They thought,
Mm,
okay, the sanctions are going to be lifted, the economy is going to be rebound. Already, people are out in the streets buying, shopping, going to coffee shops. So already you saw that kind of that lever, that pressure lever against the regime really kind of lifting as soon as the JCPOA was signed. And there is an argument that that the JCPOA could have been a better agreement.
sure.
It could have been better. It really could have been much better. And what the Obama administration, I think, in my opinion, had before the JCPOA was they achieved something incredible. And that was they managed to get not just the Europeans, but also the Russians and the Chinese together to agree on an incredibly crippling sanctions package, which brought Iran to its knees,
Hmm.
where it was ready to negotiate and make incredible terms. And I don't think American negotiators realized just how effective that was. And then they ended up signing the JCPOA, which was not as effective as it could be because they underestimated just how much they'd achieved with that sanctions regime. Um, so yeah, I think that could happen. But I agree with you that the JCPOA could have continued. You
Hmm.
could have seen where it goes. Where does it lead? Improve certain clauses. And I think some of the problem was the discussion, the excitement, the buzz, the gossip that surrounded the JCPOA, that somehow this would usher in new cooperation between the United States and Iran, perhaps even replace old allies with a new US-Iranian partnership that would develop 10 years down the line if confidence is boosted and this JCPOA leads them down to a path of mutual cooperation. That was poisonous chatter. And
Yeah.
what that did is it brought the Israelis and the Gulf states to the point of alarm, where they kind of really kind of had common cause in opposing the JCPOA, as did the opponents of Obama.
Yeah. Let's get into yeah, no, I mean the as far as the JCPOA goes, that happened. I mean, I was still well, I'm still not that old, but I'll have to go research some of those things because I need to brush up a little bit on the history of that part. But you mentioned the Gulf states, and I think that's been I don't know if underreported is the right word because I think people have touched on it for sure. But moving back kind of into the well, I don't know. Where do you think is a good place to start of like the end of the Ottoman Empire
Yeah, 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 yeah. We're
and that
making
sort
the
of
modern
thing
Middle East.
and making into the modern Middle East? Is that where do you think is a good place to start?
We can do that. We can do that.
Okay,
What what
perfect.
what what interests you? So, what did you have in mind when you were kind of thinking
So
about what doesn't get reported?
so some of the stuff that at least that I've had episodes on so far has been um the Zionist movement into the creation of like Israel and Palestine pre-World War II, so King Crane Commission and Lord Balfour Declaration and some of these other things. Um, but the Turkey piece and the Ottoman Empire, at least when I remember learning about it, it was like, okay, we've got the Ottoman Empire, and then we just forget about that for a while. Lawrence of Arabia exists, and then now it's Turkey. So like what goes on in that end of things as well? It's just like as from maybe I don't know what end of World War One type like
Okay.
what's going on in that region from like end of World War One to World War Two like between end of World War One and like I guess we can call World War Two modern era-ish.
Okay, so in Turkey, the key dates here are 1918 and 1923. Between 1918 and 1923, there is essentially a Turkish War of Independence. And really, the great powers towards the end of World War One, and Turkey was on the side of the Central Powers. So they were with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and That, by the way, is quite interesting that they chose that side. And of course, that put them against the British. And the British had a failed campaign during World War One in the Dardanelles in a very, very beautiful part of the country, which is deceptively beautiful if you go there today, by the way. And then it's really kind of hard to kind of wrap your head around what a huge battle took place in the shores of Gallipoli. So in
Was
1915, the
Churchill involved in that, if I remember?
it was Churchill's brainchild.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. I do.
Churchill's
Okay.
brainchild was to send ships and into the Dardanelles Straits to go up into Constantinople, which was the capital of the Ottoman Empire, take out the Ottoman Empire, and by doing that, you're taking out one of the strong allies of the Central Powers, and you would also have strong communication channels all the way into Russia to help on the Russian front as well. And that was a kind of a way of kind of breaking the stalemate that was happening in Europe in the trenches.
And also,
So
before you
in
go
Western
on,
front.
at like where is the Ottoman Empire borders in terms
So at
of
this,
Gulf
yeah,
states
okay.
elsewhere?
So at this time, the Ottoman Empire is going through a period of what some historians call a decline. Other historians disagree, but what is certainly happening is the Ottoman Empire used to be huge, used to really kind of dominate the East Mediterranean, but it's becoming smaller. It's becoming smaller because there's different empires competing with it, which are taking off different chunks, and they're also facing different nationalist revolts in different part of the empire. So by the time it's World War One, Turkey was no longer much of a European empire before. 100 years earlier, it was called the sick man of Europe because it had significant European possessions. But by the time you're talking about World War One, there's some small territory in the Balkans. It has Thrace, and that's pretty much it. The rest of the empire is what we see as Turkey today, and also what we call Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, with the exception of Basra, and then down to Mecca, Medina, also Palestine, Transjordan or Jordan as well, and this is the place of the battlefields during World War One. You earlier mentioned Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia was part of the campaign with the Arab nationalists, especially in the Hijaz kind of area, to fight against the Ottomans. And ultimately, that's quite successful. In the kind of period after World War One, there are kind of plans to divide up the Ottoman Empire into different spheres of influence between the United Kingdom and France. These different spheres of influence were discussed during World War One as well. At the time, the British also made, I wouldn't say promises, but declarations of intent to create a Jewish national home in Palestine, while also giving declarations of intent to Arab nationalists that there will be kind of a larger Arab kingdom that would also incorporate parts of Palestine too. So that becomes very problematic. Ultimately, the Ottoman Empire lose in World War One, and they're really reduced to kind of a rump area in Anatolia. So what happens from 1918 onwards is that there's a war of independence. One of the kind of the military generals who is successful in the Dardanelles against the British is a gentleman called Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, and he leads a rebellion which is a really kind of grinding rebellion, which kind of pushes out the different international forces and troops which are there, most especially against the Greeks and also the kind of different French positions over towards the east of the country, and more or less with some issues here and there. What Turkey is today is the ceasefire lines of World War One.
Hmm. So you mentioned the British declarations, and for those listening who did listen to Dr. Singh's first episode, that's kind of the area that we've zoomed in on, where the British need help in the war, so they're air quotes promising all sorts of land to all sorts of people if they give them some help against the Ottomans. So that's the zoomed in area that we spoke in that episode. But okay, so that's the end of World War One. Now, where from the Gulf states? So I want to go stay more like Gulf states, Iraq, like
Okay,
Persia.
so
So like, and also, where's Persia at this point, like in their history? Because they have a very different history from the Ottomans, and I think at least sometimes when I'm thinking back to like Middle Eastern history, I get the two kind of mixed up, but not really because they're in the same area, and I know they're both empires, but the people are
they're
different.
both they're both empire. Yeah, the
Yeah,
people are different,
people
even
very
though there
different.
is the kind of a Turkic kind of population
Hmm.
in the western part of Iran, kind
Yeah.
of the kind of close to Azerbaijan. Yeah, they're different peoples, even though there's some overlap. There's Kurds in Turkey and there's Kurds in Iran too. And at this point, it's very much under the influence of the British. Persia is, and it's kind of it has its own empire, and it's really the British which are kind of dominating in Persia. Down in Iraq, as what's known now, it's a little bit different. So after World War One, the British already have in possession of Basra, and they want that to kind of be a state under the influence of British control. So with Basra, what they say is, well, this is quite small territory. It's not militarily defensible. We need to increase the scope. Now, Basra was a former Ottoman district, a Velayet, and and they said, okay, so what we need to do is kind of join it to a neighboring Vilayet, the Vilayet of Baghdad. Now this is more militarily cohesive, but it's not really economically feasible. Okay, you know what we need to do now is stick on another vignette, the one of Mosul, and that way it will be economically, militarily cohesive. This is what a proper state would look like. So that's what they did there, and that's really the borders of Iraq today. There is a problem with that, even though that kind of makes sense from an imperial perspective. What that did was join very different demographic localities together, which hadn't been unified together really ever. And now they were there. It created tensions between local elites, different groups. The religious and ethnic makeup were really quite all over the place, as was the terrain and the geography of these different places and the locations of where the wealth was, resources, etc., etc. So even though it kind of made sense for the British, it didn't necessarily make sense anywhere else for Iraq. If you kind of go a little bit elsewhere and you think of, so you had a conversation before about the Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons and their revolt against the British. Sorry, their revolt against the Ottomans, and their siding with the British during World War One. Well, the sons of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca were awarded. One of them was awarded Iraq. The other was supposed to be in Syria, but he was pushed out, and another was in what we now call Jordan, or at the time was Transjordan. So trans because it's one side of the River Jordan. And then later that just gets changed. So those are those kind of states there. And then there is the Hijaz, which essentially loses a kind of a battle against another power in Najd, in the kind of neighboring kind of region, and that is the House of Saud. And what takes place there is a kind of an interesting one because the British were very much supportive of Sharif of the Sharif of Mecca, but it was the India office who kind of preferred the House of Saud. So it's essentially a battle between two allies of the British, and ultimately the House of Saud then dominated, and by 1928, I think it is, or 1930. Get my dates mixed up there. You've had the establishment of Saudi Arabia, which has its different tensions with neighboring states, but finally is established. In the case of Kuwait, Kuwait was a kind of an earlier protectorate of the British, which then has its independence a little bit later, and some of the other Gulf states, it's the same case up into a little bit later into the 1960s.
So this is kind of the map that is forming in the late 20s, 30s is kind of more or less similar to the one that we see today. Is that
Yeah.
the time period?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So it's,
forgive me
yeah.
for asking a very stupid question. I know it's a very stupid question, and the reason I know it's stupid is because it's quite naive. It's like kind of like the little kid question. Why don't they just do whatever? But and we see this kind of in Africa too, when the colonial powers draw the lines and they combine tribes or ethnicities together that like inevitably will cause conflict. At this point today, we could just have somebody go be like, okay, you have this part and you have that part, or like you just ask them, like, what do you want? And then we just leave and like you do what you want. I know that's not how that would actually work, but like you would think that somebody there would have thought of it like, hey, we're not supposed to be like, we don't like you. We'll just take this part and you guys take that part. Anyways, I digress. I understand that that will
So,
not happen, but
so the idea, by the way, behind that, and the reason why that didn't take place is part of the reason behind the concept and the idea of a mandate system, which was
mm,
prescribed by the League of Nations. So, in the case of Iraq, in the case of Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, the British and the French were given a mandate by the League of Nations, and the concept behind that was the great powers would guide the locals into the difficult trappings of statehood because they weren't yet ready to be states in the international
well,
community.
that's
And under
gone
the
well.
guidance of the British, under the guidance of the French, that would take place. That didn't really take place. But as I said, there was a kind of a difference between what makes sense locally and what makes sense in imperial terms. In imperial
Hmm.
terms, the state of Iraq makes total sense. And if Britain was going to have influence over the state of Iraq, then so does the state of Jordan. Makes total sense, and so on and so forth. So it does make sense from an imperial perspective. So they weren't looking at the interests of the local
Well,
shock you to
of
believe
course,
of the local
shocking.
population.
Shocking.
Another thing as well, by the way, we didn't have at the time, we started it at the time, the kind of Middle Eastern studies departments at universities. They
Mm,
were starting to form, but it wasn't the same extent. Many of the elites among the British and the French who were out there, they were versed in classics. So they knew the terrain very well from reading the Greek classics, and that sometimes they refer to it by its if not Greek, then its ancient names from their ancient history that they learned.
well, good. Fantastic. Um, okay, so at what point does the British start to pull out? Like they start to be like, you know what, we don't have the money from World War One, like we're not in a great spot. We don't want it anymore. Do what you want. Like at what point does that start to occur?
After World War II. So
After World War Two. Okay,
it
so they
happens a little
kept
bit
it.
later.
Okay, so into World War Two, we still got British control over Persia, Jordan, Iraq, large areas in there. Um, is Saudi Arabia independent at this point as
Yes.
well? Okay,
Saudi
so
Arabia
like,
is
is the Gulf relatively independent as well, or is Saudi Arabia the only and
sort of.
Turkey the only
So
one?
So the Gulf states are not really independent until a bit later, until the 1960s. Um, but the position of the British here is quite hands off. Yes, they are kind of ruled, but they prefer to rule by treaty rights. So like, okay, you govern, but when it comes to military affairs, we're the bosses here. When it comes to foreign affairs, oh, you consult us, and if you don't, well, that's going to be really, really something that you don't want to do. And that really came to the fore, by the way, in Egypt, where it was a kind of a similar story,
Mm,
where during World War II, King Farouk, he was very reluctant to support the British. And so, troops rolled up outside of the palace, and he was asked in no uncertain terms to change his policy position. So that was kind of how it was arranged. So the British like to be hands off. The exception to that, by the way, is actually Palestine. In the 1930s, there was the Arab Revolt. And then just after World War II, that's when it was the Zionist time to revolt.
isn't
So
this
by the
when like Ben Gurion and all them are starting to go over there and the conflict is? Is like the internal
Ben Gurion
conflict
goes. Ben Gurion's over there a lot earlier. He's part of
earlier?
the way. Yeah. Oh yeah. Much earlier in the kind
Was
of
that
the
Stern, like
second
the
idea.
Stern Gang, I think is one, if I recall correctly,
The
and there's a
Stern Gang is one of the groups.
okay, and there's a
They've
few
launched
others
the
and lots of
Stern Gang
conflict
has.
in there.
Yeah, yeah, they've launched like the Stern Group, also the Irgun. They've launched a rebellion against the British after 1945. The mainstream, so Ben Gurion's Haganah has done it in 1945 as well for a short period of several months. They kind of join together and then they do their own kind of operations independently. But the point for the British is that by the time it's 1947 they have 100,000 troops or forces, security forces present in Palestine. So that's not how the British like to operate. They like to have a more hands-off approach. And so that's one of the reasons why Palestine becomes a significant headache for the British. But for the most part, the British want to influence affairs by not having their footprint on there. But even by the time it's World War II, by the time it's 1945 and the guns have gone silent. The British are broke. In Britain, there's still long lines for basic food rations.
Mm,
It's a empire which truly is in decline. It cannot afford to be in all these different places. And they realize that in order for Britain to prosper, they need to give up on the empire. And that starts to happen really first in Greece, in Turkey as well, to a certain extent as well, where they kind of ask the Americans to kind of step in there to kind of support any kind of anti-communist agitation in Greece because the British can't afford to do it. That's usually where they would do it. And slowly there is different independent movements as well, with the withdrawal from India, of course. And then if you take away India, then why is the Middle East so important for Britain?
yeah.
There's the transit route to India. So once the kind of the empire starts to collapse, slowly, all of it doesn't make any sense anymore.
Mm.
So yeah.
So was my statement earlier about the British promising people land if they fought with them in the war, was that a World War One or World War Two? Did I
That was
misspeak?
World War One.
Okay, so I was right. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we get through World War Two. And actually, before we get to there, during between World War One and World War Two, is there a lot of internal conflict in the Middle East, or is it mostly kind of they know that the British are going to squash some things, and it's mo like, is it? Well, I don't like what is going on there from so they're
Both,
forming statehood, there's wars of
both.
independence in Turkey, etc. But like from the rest of it, like what's going on over there?
So your earlier point of it not being kind of reported very much is certainly the case here. In some places it is more quiet, but in others it is certainly there. I mean, one of the first commissioners in in Iraq certainly had to deal with uprisings after uprisings. So first of all, starting with Turkey, and not even putting the British into the picture, just Turkey, which has just declared itself independent in 1923, still has a Kurdish uprising on its hands in the east of the country. And that continues to be the case right into the 1930s. And then it goes quiet, then reignites in the late 1970s and the early 1980s with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK. So the origins of that really go into the making of the state of Turkey. In Iraq itself, there's several Kurdish rebellions against the British in the 1920s and 1930s. That certainly does not go away at all. In Palestine, there is the Arab Revolt of the 1930s. So, and that is a significant revolt which lasts for 3 years, and really galvanizes a lot of attention against the Zionist movement and the British support for our homeland. And the French are not faring any better in Syria, which is constantly a place where there's different trouble spots. So this is not smooth. And of course, in what's now Saudi Arabia, there is that tension between and the conflict between the House of Saud and the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, which ultimately leads to him being defeated. So yes, those tensions continue, and there are also tensions and border skirmishes between Saudi Arabia and Jordan, which which are there too. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
it's not all quiet in the Middle East.
Yeah. So during World War II, do those things continue or are they kind of put on pause by what's going on in the Pacific and in Europe?
Yeah. So in the case of Palestine, um, they are put on pause to a certain degree. By 1939, the British has already quelled the Arab revolts. So the Palestine Arab revolt is really quelled. But then what they do is they offer the Palestinians exactly what they wanted, which is a limitation of Jewish immigration into Palestine and into land sales for Jews in Palestine too. And they do that because they don't want to deal with an uprising. Or for the uprising to reignite. And they know that the Jews of Palestine are not going to go against the British while they're fighting the Nazis. So they managed to calm it down that way. In Egypt, there are different movements. There are some which are very suspicious of the British, and they see that the Germans have their positions in North Africa. They threaten British positions. One of the individuals who wants to do that is an individual called Anwar Sadat. Who later signs a peace treaty with Menachem Begin and
Yeah.
becomes the president of Egypt. But he was actually in a jail in Egypt for most of the war because he was part of a ring to try and support the Germans during World War II. So there is that tension as well, and they managed to get the Egyptians on side in World War II, but that's not an easy process. In the case of Iraq, there was a Rashid Ali revolt, and basically that's a pro-Nazi movement in 1941 in Iraq, which the British have to quell in order to keep that kind of area quiet while they deal with the rest of World War II. So yes. This is not an easy place during
No.
World War II either.
Yeah. Okay, so is there anything from the end of World War One to the end of World War Two that you think maybe flies under the radar that really informs how things happened that maybe people don't really know about or is a bit um underreported or I don't know, something of the sort that we were talking about before we started recording?
Oh, well. Huh. So, so it's quite a big time period. So it's kind of hard to say.
Yeah, I know there's a lot in there, but maybe like one or two interesting like little nickels or something that people can fun facts maybe. Well, it might not be fun, but
So yeah, fun facts of what happened there. So within Palestine itself, you see the beginnings of a state within a state forming within the Jews of Palestine. And that's something which I find very interesting. If anyone wants to know why in 1948, for example, the nascent Jewish state was so victorious against invading Arab armies, well, you can think of several reasons, but one of them was it was already functioning as a state. The institutions of what you would think of as statehood is being established. And why I mention that and why I think that's interesting is that that wasn't necessarily happening in other places where mandates should have been preparing, based on their League of Nations mandate for statehood. So these institutions were essentially weak in other parts. So that I find really interesting. Already it was quite interesting to see what Israel would become or what the Zionists would become. Would they become socialist or would they become democratic? Would they look towards Russia or elsewhere? And also what was taking place in the region. Like look at Turkey, for example. Turkey was during World War II, the place where spies would meet and be. So Istanbul was kind of like a city of spies. Everyone was spying on each other in this strategic waterway. And what Turkey was constantly trying to do was stay out of the war, not be involved in it, because they saw how devastating World War I was for them. So they said, okay, we have to stay out of World War II, but instead this became a place and a nest of espionage for all different sides. What was interesting in Iraq was, I think, not just the Rashid Ali coup or attempted coup, but also there was a large pogrom against the Jewish community in Iraq. And that really kind of started the basis of potential migration out of Iraq into different parts of the world, including the state of Israel. So that I find really, really pivotal. And one of the individuals who witnessed that pogrom was my favorite historian, a gentleman called Eddie Kadori. And if anyone is interested in these kind of histories that we're talking about, check out Eddie Kadori. He is kind of seen as, he's quite conservative, actually. His argument is Britain had an imperial responsibility, which it failed, and its imperial responsibility was to prevent such things. He was very interested in terms of nationalism, and
Mm.
he's written a lot about nationalism. So yes, and some of his ideas were formed because of that, watching that kind of pogrom in
I
Iraq.
mean,
So
yeah,
yeah,
I can imagine. So for those listening, if you want to have nightmares, you can go look up what a pogrom is. Because those are especially the ones in Eastern Europe, and we're like, yeah, I wish I didn't look that up to be honest, but I did, so here we are. Um, but okay, so all right, so World War II ends, British Empire is coming to an end, and they're kind of like, all right, we're out. US reluctantly,
reluctantly.
yeah, of course, well, of course. And so then France, I believe, is still involved in Syria to some extent, a little bit. And then, like, because the US at this point is kind of like baby world empire, kind of, a little bit.
Yeah.
And so where, like, those period between does the US have like immediate influence in there? And I think, well, to some extent you can say yes because of 1953 and the Shah in Iran, that is only 8 years. So between the end of World War II and that occurring. But this period between British taking a step back, US kind of building all its bases in the region. Like, what's that time period like? And how long does that actually take? Like, is the premise
This
of my question correct, or was the US in there
Yeah,
immediately?
yeah. So this is the kind of the time when the US kind of fills in the void of the United Kingdom, basically. And at the time, the United Kingdom is not thinking, oh, okay, we'll hand it over to our American cousins. They'll take care of the business. No, no, no. They were like, we will steer, we will use our expertise to guide the Americans what the correct foreign policy should be. And that's very much the thinking that the Americans are not, they don't know what they're doing, so we have to help them. At this time, this is really the golden age of popular opinion towards the United States. America was pretty much loved. There was a lot of different missionary schools, hospitals, which were established, right from the late 19th century. And these were very much appreciated in the region because even though arguably the United States was becoming an empire in its kind of backyard, it wasn't in the Middle East. And it was seen as kind of no strings attached, as opposed to the equivalents in France or the United Kingdom, which had that imperial baggage. So the United States was appreciated. In fact, when US ships went through the Bosphorus Straits in Istanbul, it was cheered. American servicemen were really liked. And what was interesting was how things kind of changed over the course of time. Now, you mentioned 1953, and it's interesting because I I find that an important development. But the United States tried to learn its lesson. So what happened about 3 years later was the Suez Crisis, and this is when Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The British and the French, especially the British, said this is incredibly dangerous. He's Britain still is an empire. It still has overseas territories. This is our oil supply. This is our communications channel into other parts of the empire, into Malaya and onwards. And we need to remove him. They concoct a plan where the Israelis attack, and then the British and the French will go and kind of intervene, but we'll have to stay here to protect it. And the United States under Eisenhower said, "Oh no, you're not doing that." After they've done it, they said, "You get out. That's enough." And if you don't, then we're going to end our land lease agreement with you, and that's going to hurt your economy. So basically, Eisenhower went to the defense of an Arab dictator over its allies, the French and the British.
Mm.
And what's interesting about that is it didn't work. He didn't reverse Gamal Abdel Nasser's negative public opinion of the United States. In private, he loved American movies, had lots of nice things to say about America, but it did not remove that that support to if not the Soviet Union, then revolutionary discussion and rhetoric. In the case of Turkey, anti-American opinion happens a little bit later. So in other words, I think you might kind of like hear that I'm kind of implying that 1953 wasn't everything.
Well,
Um,
no, of course not. But like from at least the way that you learn it in school, for instance, 1953 is a big year.
it's a
Some
big
things
deal.
happen, right? But that also doesn't mean, right? There's other places later that we have mucked it up. Like it's
So,
the is it or is
so
it more domino?
So American involvement in 1953 wasn't necessarily known to the same extent in 1953. So
Sure.
it's
Okay.
really important to remember that at that time, it didn't necessarily resonate that, oh, this is an American-backed coup. It's America who has done this to us, and then it spreads across the Middle East. So each state had its own potential reasons for being either pro or against the United States. So Turkey, it's later. Turkey is after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the United States says, "Oh, okay, we're going to then remove a Jupiter missiles from Turkey." And from Turkey's perspective, it's like, what, you're not going to defend us? We're being sold by
Yeah.
driving. And that's really kind of the origins of like the of anti-Americanism in Turkey, and also not taking Turkey's side during the Cyprus crisis. So the 1964 Johnson letter. So it happens a little bit later. It's different in different
What is the
context.
Cyprus crisis?
Also, this is a crisis in Cyprus, and this is an island which is populated by Greeks and Turks, so Christians and Muslims, and it was quite an integrated island. But within the Greek-speaking parts, there was the concept of enosis, of unification with the Greeks, and this is something that the local Turkish population, which for the most part enjoyed good relations with most Greeks, looked to Turkey to try and come as a kind of a savior. So there was a possibility of a Turkish intervention in 1963, 1964. President Johnson in the US says, "No, you're not." Right, in a very, very harshly worded letter, and that does not resonate well within Turkey itself. And then when you take the kind of the Jupiter missiles as well from the 1960s onwards, I wouldn't say the US lost Turkey, but it lost Turkish public opinion.
Mm. Okay.
Maintain elite support. So I think that's really kind of how it happens in different places. In the case of Israel, relations with the United States, I wouldn't say are bad. They're not great either into the 1950s and the 1960s. So some of the opposition towards the US or anti-Americanism, which kind of emerges, is not necessarily because of Israel, not until after 1967. During the 1950s, I think it was 1951, there's something called the Tripartite Declaration, where the British, the French, and the Americans kind of get together and they say, okay, we've had a big war in 1948. We know that there could be another Arab-Israeli war. What do we do to try and prevent that from happening? And they said, we'll do responsible arms sales. So we will not try and upset the balance of power between the different countries here. We will not let one country get militarily the upper hand, because if we do, they will think that they can then launch round two. So in the case of Israel, it was always looking for a country to get more arms. And it finally found that with the French, not with the Americans. And if you look at 1967, most of the technology that the US was using, military hardware, was French. In fact, the Dimona nuclear site mirrors the French nuclear facility. So Yeah, it's only later that the kind of like the sometimes when you hear the kind of the cry of the US supporting Israel as a source of anger, that's quite later actually. That's not what someone would have said if you asked someone, I don't know, in Baghdad, why do you hate Israel? Or why do you hate America? In 1965, it wouldn't necessarily be because of support for Israel. There would have
Mm.
been other issues.
So the involvement starts to grow in the mid 50s, 60s is when the US starts to really
Yeah, it gets
like.
better in the there's this so in the 1950s. So Eisenhower's a bit hands off. There is there is moral support, there's cultural support, there's even positive feelings towards Israel. Under the Kennedy administration, there are kind of arms deals that which are made, but it's not extensively so. The
Kennedy
big
didn't want to give them nuclear stuff though, right? Is that
no, no,
true?
no, 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 not at all, not at all, not
Yeah.
at all, not at all. Like if you look at who are the big allies of the United States in the region during that time, it's Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's not Israel. There was some within the US, within policymaking elites who said, oh, okay, if you want to look for the most dynamic and vibrant country, it will be Israel.
Mm.
And in many respects, there was an argument to that. That's true. The institutions were stronger. There was a democracy taking place, but that wasn't necessarily what the US was looking for. Um, so yeah, there was another point that I was going to say to you about that. Yes, and that is this. Like during that period, that post World War II period, the Middle East state is incredibly fragile before the Assads came to power. So before Hafez al-Assad came into power, like in Syria, there was a coup nearly every year. I mean, there were so many military coups. In 1951, there were three military coups. And could you imagine from the perspective of a negotiator? So, you know, at the time, the United States was involved in a lot of negotiations between Israel and the Arab states. A lot of the time, they were indirect, but you had no real address in Syria because it was so unstable. The same thing in Iraq as well. We're talking about a very unstable period where you have a kind of a leaders in, but you know you don't know if they're going to be around for the next 10 years.
Mm. So where so as the Middle East starts to go towards, I'll say like the 80s, 90s type time period with the PLO, Saddam Hussein, etc., like that sort of period. Another question that comes to mind often for me is the interests of these specific countries. Like, given the how entangled everything is, you would think, like, if I'm there, I'm like, I would not want to be attacking anyone because you cannot control what happens next because they might get involved and they might get involved and then they might get involved and then you might have the US come get involved and then depending on right well at this point I guess the US has not been funding both sides of wars um in that region yet but like what is the I don't really know what I'm asking. I guess I'm asking like what is the thinking of the countries that are in the region in terms of like regional power and relationship building there, not relationship building. You've got the Sunni and Shiite piece as well in there, but like what's the thinking of the countries behind like, yeah, we're gonna attack or we're not gonna attack or we're gonna be friends with this one but not this other one? Because it seems like there's kind of very arbitrary reasons why some of them are friends with each other and also some of them don't like each other. Is that a
Yeah,
fair assessment? Is the premise of the question reasonable or
I think I know what you're saying. Is that why is the
okay.
Middle East so volatile? Why is
Yeah.
one state attacking another?
Like once it
Why?
gets to that point, like I get once the British are there and they're meddling around with things, but like once the powers kind of back off, and I know the US is involved, but like what's preventing it from being less the way it is? That probably doesn't sound good. Don't cancel me,
Okay,
people,
all
but
right. So so I take so why after the imperial powers have essentially left, the
hmm
nation states is the nation state,
right. So
right?
people,
It
and I
is.
also understand that there's power vacuums and people are fighting for power. So I
Yeah.
get that that happens as well. But once they start to form in more kind of concrete terms, and you get kind of these strong, like Saddam Hussein wasn't a great guy, obviously, but I think for the most part, Iraq was relatively stable when he was there. No?
So there was a period when Saddam Hussein is in charge, and it's hard to say exactly when because he was also dominating his Abu Bakr, who was his uncle, who was also the president, and Saddam was
Mm,
the vice. The real power person behind Abu Bakr was Saddam Hussein. There was a period of relative stability, but there were incredible fights, revolts by the Kurdish groups, which were being put down even into the 1970s. So it was never kind of stable in that sense. And then after that, 1980, there's the Iran-Iraq War. It's a
yeah.
devastating war where a million people are killed on both sides. So it's very difficult to find that stable kind of period that one hopes to find. And don't forget that Saddam Hussein himself came to power or through essentially a coup within the Ba'ath Party. And Abu Bakr, who was his uncle and the previous president, they came to power through a
Okay.
coup as
So
well.
maybe
So
scratch my question then.
so I mean the important thing to note there is the Middle East states internally, leaving aside the Gulf monarchies. That's something a little bit different. They have the gift of oil wealth in that sense, and they have a kind of they have what some could call traditional legitimacy through that kind of monarchy. But when you kind of look at the republics, there is a legitimacy crisis, and that legitimacy crisis creates internal instability. One way in which you can deal with internal instability is wage warfare with your neighbors, which often happens. And there is also the very concept that the nation or the nation state exists is being challenged. So Gamal Abdel Nasser is essentially calling for Arab nationalism, but it's not just Egypt being the vanguard of the Arab nationalism. It's actually a broader, greater Middle East state. And the idea and the argument is that they all belong to the same people. It should be one state. And there's a union or an attempted union between Egypt and Syria in 1958. It lasts just a few years. And this was the dream of the Baathists in Syria to have
Mm,
this one Arab nation. So they think this is going to be wonderful. Gamal Abdel Nasser leading the Arab world, fighting off the vestiges and the remnants of colonialism, and unifying the Arab world against the Zionist entity of Israel. And they're thinking this is wonderful, but then they find out that as soon as they're kind of unified with Egypt, who are the top jobs going to? Egyptians. Who's benefiting from this? Egyptians. What's happening to the Syrian economy? Oh, it's being used for it's getting transferred to Egypt. And then soon they're talking about Egyptian colonialism or Egyptian imperialism. So they kind of they split up and they break off, right? So that is one of the problems there. And by vestiges of imperialism, they're also looking to places like Jordan. They're saying, well, Jordan, well, what kind of state are you? Why are you a state? Jordan should be part of Syria. It's technically Syria anyway. That's what it was during the Ottoman Empire. So they're sponsoring elements within Jordan, such as the PLO, to launch revolutions, right? So there's all these kind of inter-Arab politics based on going right back to ideas that were happening while it was under control of the Ottoman Empire.
okay.
Different notions of what is the Arab nation, and then mix into that, you've got the primary question of political philosophy, which is who gets to rule.
Yeah.
Well, everyone wants to rule. Well, who gets to rule? And why do you get to rule? And what kind of rule will you have? And why is that legitimate? Is always being asked. And it's not just being asked in polite terms or in a kind of an election chamber. It's happening, within the halls of different factions within the military.
Yeah. That's a good answer. Yeah. I well, some of that I probably had an inkling of, but no, that makes total sense. Um, Okay, so as we move from 50s, 60s into kind of 70s, 80s, sort of time into 90s, we haven't mentioned Afghanistan yet. Um, the Soviets during the 80s are in Afghanistan. The US, I know, is funding the Mujahideen, which is Osama bin Laden's kind of group in there, and that's we see that is that at the point in which we see kind of the rise of the sort of the terrorist arm of like that, like if you're looking at history, like before that point, I guess terrorism existed, but not the way that we think of it now. Is that sort of the rise of that time period,
No,
or is
no, no,
it
no,
before?
no, no, not necessarily. So, okay, yeah. So the US does support the Mujahideen. It's not necessarily Bin Laden's group at all. So it's not Al Qaeda.
Well, he's
Uh,
involved.
there's different factions,
Okay, but
and
is he involved though? I don't want to misspeak.
he's not an element to really worry about at that time.
Okay,
So it's he kind of emerges a little bit later. He emerges as an important figure after the first kind of Gulf War. It's really the second Gulf War of 1990, 1991.
okay,
And the idea of like using Saudi bases within the holy soil being defiled by the United States is really what militates him to then kind of go to Afghanistan and be part of that.
okay.
So
So
there are
that's in his
elements of what would
declaration
be
of
the
war, right?
Taliban.
From
Yeah,
that's
that's
it.
correct.
Okay.
Well, there
So
are elements of the Taliban which were fighting against the Soviets. That's certainly the case, absolutely. But just kind of going back to the kind of the question about modern terrorism. Yeah, terrorism really starts with well, it doesn't really start, but it kind of begins not necessarily on religious grounds. It's really kind of there's some of the secular nationalists who engage in it. So the PLO is the one that kind of really brings it into the international attention. So 1970 is an important date here. So terrorism has happened before.
mhm.
You can think the first kind of hijackings around 1968. And there's another incident, 1969, a couple more incidents actually. But 1970 was a huge one because this is when four international airliners were hijacked by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This was a faction which was sometimes in the PLO, sometimes out of the PLO. It had a kind of a turbulent relationship with the PLO's leader, Yasser Arafat. But the Popular Front, they hijacked four airliners, brought them to Jordan to a disused runway called Dawson's Field, and live on television blew them up or blew three of them up, and that was for the world to see. And that was essentially the 9/11 of its day. Within different aviation circles, the idea of this tight security in airports, it kind of starts then, where they kind of see, well, okay, hijackings have become a really big thing. And 1972 Munich Olympic Games,
Mhm.
there's the taking of Israeli hostages and their murder, and then it kind of continues there. Those are by secular movements. Elsewhere, taking place in Egypt, is the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood then become essentially kind of the guiding principles for more kind of extreme Islamist movements, such as Al Qaeda, which kind of look at some of the different principles by early Muslim Brotherhood figures, Al-Banna, especially a gentleman by the name of Said Qutb. And they look at his different ideas, and then they employ those kind of terrorist tactics for those kind of Islamist purposes, such as 9/11 that we kind of like saw.
Okay. So between
And by the way,
this,
just
yeah,
adding
yeah.
to that, if I may, there's also the first suicide attack that takes place, I think it's 1988, in during the first Intifada, by a Hamas operative.
Mm,
And that is the steering of a bus off a cliff where he took control of it. And I can't remember exactly how many people were killed, but it was quite a large casualty incident that happened in Israel at the time, and that kind of started the kind of like the suicide bombings and warfare that you see today.
Okay, okay, that makes sense. There's so many names and dates and things that happened. It's definitely tough to keep track
It's
of
totally
all of it.
fascinating. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
a fascinating
it
topic.
is. So, okay, so between 70s and 80s, what's kind of mm, actually, you know what? Let's do this. I am gonna operate off the assumption that you've also enjoyed this conversation, and we can do like 70s, 80s, 90s in a separate one maybe later.
Sounds
Um,
good.
so your book that I
Yes.
didn't want to kind of run through the whole episode without talking about it. Do you want to
Uh,
tell the people about your book, why you wanted to write it, what's it about,
sure.
all that sort of stuff?
Sure. So I've just written a book. It's my third book. This book is called "Looking for Elsewhere: The Jews of Turkey Then and Now." And what that is it's a personal exploration of the history, the present circumstances, and the future trajectory of the Jews of Turkey. And essentially, I'm asking. This used to be a very large community, well over 80,000 in 1927, and now it's a shadow of its former self, perhaps as low as 10,000, maybe even less Jews are still there together. So I'm asking why that is the case. Why was this decline? What does that mean for the community today? And what does it mean for other Jewish communities in different parts of the world? And, I explore these different themes by talking to lots of people, explaining their story, telling my story, and also discussing nationalism, discussing identity, belonging, hate, anti-Semitism, racism, prejudice, and all those different things. So that's what that book is about, and you get a whole bunch of Turkish politics in the mix.
Very nice. And you can find it where Amazon, everywhere that books
Yeah, you
are.
can find it depending on where you are. You go to your local Amazon. It's there for you to order. If you don't want Amazon and you prefer your local bookshop, it should be there. Barnes and Noble in the States, I think. Um, in the UK, we've got Waterstones, Blackwells. Yeah, it should be
Okay.
there for. At the
Okay.
moment, it's there for pre-order. It's available at the end of July, but you can pre-order it now.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Lastly, I'm going to put you on the spot. We're going to bring it back to modern day. If you if you had to predict the next step of the Iran war currently, actually, I'll ask two questions. Prediction as to what's going to happen, and then also if you were in charge of both Iran and the US, what would you do? So there's like kind of three things in there.
Oh, okay. So prediction. I wish I knew with the prediction because you know what? I've got a trip, kind of a research trip to Israel lined up, and I want to know if it's going to go ahead, right? Because I can it's cheaper if I kind of cancel or change my flights now, right? So I wish I kind of knew the answer in terms of predicting. It's so volatile at the moment. I think it's coming to an end. One of the things that I think is really interesting is Israel doesn't usually do long wars. It does short wars. It's been successful in doing short wars, 67, 56, even 70, 73. These were short wars. It's geared towards them. And it's been in low intensity, high intensity, then low intensity for 2.5 years, going on its 3 years. It has to come to a point where things are going to calm down. I find it difficult to predict what's going to happen in Iran. I'm pretty sure that there will be an agreement, if not tomorrow, the day after, then shortly, which is not going to be a permanent agreement. It's going to be the start of principles for further discussions. And those discussions will drag on perhaps right until the end of the year. I don't think it's gonna happen anytime soon. But eventually there will be a little bit of more calm, not quiet, but calm in the region. If I were the Iranian regime, I don't know what I would do because there's too many addresses. There is the position of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. There's the position of religious figures, of Khamenei. There's the position of the Iranians in the streets. So there's so many different addresses right now. But what I would want, what's the common denominator with all of them is not for the state to collapse.
Mm.
It's one thing for the regime to collapse, it's another thing for the state to collapse. The state to collapse, you want to avoid at all costs for all parties concerned.
Yeah, then
Um,
you'd end up with Libya or Syria times a
Exactly,
thousand.
exactly, exactly. And you don't want that. That's the worst case scenario. So if I were a protester trying to push the regime out, I would want that, but try and allow some kind of avenue for members of the regime to be part of whatever future project that you have in mind. And I would want members of the regime to think the same way.
Yeah.
Um,
If you're in the regime, are you happy with how it's gone so far? To me, at least just looking at it from the outside, I would be not super happy with some of the destruction, but pulling out the Strait of Hormuz stoppage as a ace in the back
I would
pocket,
not be happy at all.
you
I would
wouldn't
not be.
be?
I wouldn't be happy because the people are unhappy.
Do they
And
care
number
about
one,
that?
yeah, and because they don't want to be overthrown.
Okay,
So,
fair enough.
so that is, I think their primary concern is not to be overthrown, is to survive. So they've survived the US, but will they survive the people? That's a lot harder because there's a lot of anger and there's resentment. And at the moment, it's going to be hard to placate that because so many people are livid at the regime.
Do you think that early on rally around the flag type thing that we saw in the so like the protests were going on in the streets, then the war
They
started,
have a
and then
different
there was
conception.
a
They have a
little bit.
different No, they have a different conception of who is a loyal Iranian. So,
Mm,
from the perspective of many of the people who are against the regime, it's really hard to predict that kind of number. Some could say as much as 90% are against the regime. I'm not sure if it's that high. I have my doubts, but I think it's still the majority. For them, the regime, the IRGC are the traitors.
mm. It's tough to tell from the outside because there was definitely some videos that came out right when the war started of people in
Sure.
support of the Ayatollah and other things as well.
Anyone it's easy if you're in a kind of a not easy, that's the right word, but if you are a dictatorial state like that,
Uh-huh.
you can mobilize 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people to work in the street. You
Exactly.
want to keep your job? Yeah, yeah, no problem. I mean,
Yeah.
you go out on the street. In fact, you don't even have to work today.
Yeah.
Bring your family to the protest.
And that's the
That
flip side of that, which is you don't really trust anything that they say either. So it makes it difficult to really.
exactly,
Anyways, I
exactly.
digress. Keep going.
And then you said there was another perspective there you
Yeah,
wanted.
if you were Trump, what would you want to have happen, or what would you do?
I would want a time machine and go back several months. I really would. I really would. I mean, like
Uh,
my position about this is if you're going to do a military intervention, you've got to do it properly. You've got to do it properly. If your position is regime change, then you need to do it properly. If you want to do regime change, yeah, you take over the Straits of Hormuz. Plus, you absolutely do arm the Kurds. You do send Kurdish forces. You have to do that because if you want to arm the opposition, then you need to go through the smuggling routes. The smuggling routes go through the Kurds. So if you want to do these things, you've got to do them properly. And the way I see it, he's not doing. Not that I would necessarily advocate regime change, but if you're going to do regime change, you've got to do it properly. So that's one thing. If you're going to go after nuclear sites, you've got to do it properly. You've got to have a landing in these nuclear facilities. You have to get boots on the ground. You have to do it properly. If you just want to stand around and negotiate, then negotiate. You could have done that before. You didn't have to get
yeah,
into this kind of war. So have a plan, have a strategy, do it properly.
yeah. Two kind of last questions or thoughts that I had. As far as the Kurds go, I think, well, I wouldn't be entirely surprised if that bridge is burned based on how things have gone previously. So I agree with your point that you need somebody on the ground, right? The smuggling routes, etc. Like you have to have that. But part of me thinks that that bridge is burned based on previous interactions. And then the second point is that I found interesting, and I mentioned this to somebody on the show. I don't remember who it was, but like going into Iraq and other things, there's been some sort of we or like Syria, it was he's got chemical weapons. Um, Gaddafi was about to go genocidal, I think, if I'm mixing them up, and then Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. There was like some kind of thing, propaganda piece that was like, well, we have to now. But with
Yeah.
this case, like, it didn't really seem that they tried that hard.
Right. Okay. So when it comes to the Kurds, it's a sad one because if you were looking for a more pro-US group, it was hard to find a more pro-US group than the Kurds, and it's different places that they reside, whether that's Syria, or Iraq, or even Iran, and it does seem that under the Trump administration, the Kurds were abandoned. But at the same time, uh, Kurdish leaders are not naive. They know their
Mm,
history. They know exactly what it's like. They weren't necessarily surprised. They had contingency plans for this, and they don't necessarily have any other option. So I don't think, I think the idea of, like, this kind of idea of like the Americans betrayed us, that's been in Kurdish folklore for many years, and they have the phrase, "We have no friends but the mountains," because they used to being betrayed. So I don't think they're surprised about it. Now is not necessarily the most
well, that it
opportune.
doesn't make it better, but
Doesn't make it better. Absolutely doesn't make it better at all. Um, in terms of getting into this conflict, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Actually, I mean, if you want to do a job, you've got to do it properly. And it seems to me that it wasn't done properly 12 months ago. That there needed to be a kind of some kind of landed in Pickaxe Mountain where there's a deeper nuclear facility that's being made. There should have been an operation 12 months ago to secure this different nuclear material. It should have just been done 12 months ago. And it
mm,
was. And because the can was kicked further down the line for some kind of, to kind of go off on some kind of a high, then we're in this place now. So yeah, no, I see what you mean. However, at the same time, nuclear weapons are nothing to scoff at.
mm-mm.
They can be devastating. So it's really, really important. And one of the important things to remember is that what led Israel to launch strikes on Iran this time last year was, not only had Iran um, produced enriched to 60%. But the International Atomic Energy Agency had also said that for the first time in about 20 years, that Iran was completely non-compliant for any kind of inspectors or things like that. And that just terrified everyone concerned.
Hmm.
And they said, we cannot take any risks with this regime anymore. In other words, there were no eyes in Iran about what's going on with the nuclear material. Before, there was at least ideas of what's taking place. But if you switch the lights off and they're operating in darkness,
Yeah.
something had to happen. But as I said, that something should have been finished 12 months ago.
Yeah, 100%. I'd love to know, like, if Tulsi Gabbard's testimony was true, why people were so concerned. And then the flip side, I'd love to know if it wasn't true, then why did she testify that in the first place?
Yeah.
Because so I mean, I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever know that. But Simon, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Do you have any last sort of nickels or thoughts before we get you out of here?
No, I don't. I think we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot of grounds, but we haven't really covered the kind of the more recent, the last 30 years or
Yeah.
so. So that's something that we could potentially do. We can kind of
Yeah.
talk about the highs and lows and potentially uh, the future of any kind of peace process. That could be interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to have you back for a part two, or maybe part two slash three, four. Continuing.
Yeah, let me know. Let me know.
Um, for those listening, the links to pre-order. Yes. Do you have other socials or anywhere people can find your
Oh
work?
yeah, yeah, sure. So on X, I'm Simon Waldman one, and I've started the Substack, which is Simon Writes Not Says, and it's mainly politics. Occasionally, I have the odd thing about books and literature, but mainly it's about Middle East stuff.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So for those listening, as usual, links will be in the description, social media, Substack, Twitter, or X. Link to pre-order the book as well. And so go check those out. Buy some merch down below. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. If well, Simon definitely didn't get anything wrong. But if I got something wrong, please let me know in the comments. I didn't have anything in
Let
front of
me
me. I was
know too if I got
going off
anything.
memory. Yeah, exactly. There you go. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Go check the links out. Go check the merch out. And we'll see you guys next time. Peace. Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.